So, thank you. So
Still
this
makes 10 minutes.
forests and forestry issues, in particular about the greater glider, where the greater glider was listed as a vulnerable species in May 2016, and the conservation advice on greater gliders identified logging and loss of hollow trees as contributors to the species decline. So what I want to know is, just talk me through that once the greater glider was listed as a vulnerable species, so when new information like this becomes available, what process does the department have in place to respond to this?
Michelle Lauder, Assistant Secretary for Forestry. So I, watching your questions on this issue with Department of Environment yesterday, Mr Richardson ran you through what happens under the EPBC Act and from the Department of the Environment. So the Department of Agriculture doesn't have a specific role when a species gets listed under the EPBC Act. So the Department of the Environment is responsible for the development of the recovery plan with the Threatened Species Committee, etc. And through their process, they do notify all the states of changed listings, etc. And as part of that process, then the states make sure that their forestry management systems take any new threatened species or listings into consideration under their codes and policies and strategies to ensure that any impact harvesting might have is considered. But often until some of the work is done on what actions need to be taken under the recovery plan as far as prescriptions, etc., there's often not a lot of information until that comes out through the recovery plan.
Right.
So this department doesn't have a specific role when something is newly listed.
Okay, so take me through then, so once the greater glider was listed in May 2016, what engagement has the department had on the fact that the greater glider was listed as vulnerable?
Really the only thing that we've had is an invitation from the Department of Environment to take part in workshops and discussions as they are working on the recovery plan for the greater glider.
Right, so you don't, through the Regional Forest Agreement, which as we know is Commonwealth State Agreement,
yes,
it doesn't trigger anything for you to then advise the state governments?
No, because that happens through the Department of the Environment.
Right. And so what you're saying is that really the main things that would kick in would be once a recovery plan is agreed to, then they would agree to a suite of actions.
Yes.
And then how would that then be reflected?
Just before you go on, before there's a recovery plan, the state might have things in place to protect that species. So, for example, for the greater glider, the recovery plan is still being developed, and I know the Victorian Government has certain things in place to ensure that if a certain number of gliders are found within a certain distance of each other...
In some forest areas in Victoria, not in all of them.
That's true. So in East Gippsland, for example...
That's right, but not in the northeast.
No. So under the East Gippsland RFA, all the strategies and codes of practice underneath that, there is prescriptions that are in place for the greater glider, for example.
But they were in place before it was listed as vulnerable.
That's true, and it was through the state processes. So the RFA, as you know, is bilateral between the Commonwealth and the state. So those things fit in under the RFA, but doesn't require changes to the high-level framework that is the RFA.
Right.
Yeah.
And in fact, so the prescriptions that were put in place for the Victorian Government, I'm not sure whether they were in place when as part of the original negotiation of the RFA or how they came to be put in place. But essentially it was the Victorian Government, probably
yes,
through their flora and fauna guarantee, that then prompted those prescriptions.
That's right, yes.
But from a Commonwealth level, you wouldn't have anything really that kicks in until the recovery plan is completed.
Yes, that's correct.
Which, as we know, can take rather a long time for some species.
I understand there's a window of 3 years from the information that Mr Richardson's told you yesterday.
Yes, and so for the greater glider having been listed as vulnerable in May 2016, so we're coming up to 2 years, we don't yet have a recovery plan.
No, so I think until it needs to be in place by May 2019.
Yes, and you know, from your perspective again, sort of what engagement have you had with the Department of Environment on the preparation of that recovery plan?
So, as I said before, we've been invited to a couple of working group meetings, and that's the extent
When were
so
they?
far. I'm sorry, I don't have any briefing on that. Can I take that on notice?
Can take that on notice. So it was just a couple. Have they been in recent times?
They were last year, as far as I remember, but we'll include the dates in the question on notice.
And so far, Minister Ruston, in the debate over my private senator's bill to abolish the RFAs, you said that I believe the RFAs have stood us in good stead, and I also believe that they have acted and assisted us in the protection of our endangered species. So how has the RFA in this instance helped with the conservation of greater gliders?
Well, I mean, obviously, Senator, you know as well as I know that there is a process through which both the state and the federal government work to ensure that we do the best that we possibly can to ensure that none of our native animals are threatened by logging. But you also know that the Threatened Species Commissioner has come out and said that he has, the previous Threatened Species Commissioner, that no animal has ever become extinct as a result of logging. Now, obviously, Senator, I'm going to finish my question, and then you can say what you like afterwards. But I'm going to finish my question, my answer to your question, if you wouldn't mind. So obviously, we work on the basis that we support a forestry industry in this country, and as part of the support of that forestry industry, we believe that we have an obligation to balance the interests of that industry as well as to protect, as best we can, the interests of our native flora and fauna. So my view is, and that was the view that I expressed in response to your particular private members' bill in relation to the RFAs, that I believe that the RFAs provided a very strong framework in which we could operate between the federal government and the EPBC Act requirements and the state governments to make sure that we had in place an appropriate level of protection and response to our native species. Now, just because you want us to never cut another tree down, that's not my view, and I don't believe that the purpose of an RFA is that. I believe the purpose of an RFA is to balance the interests of all of the stakeholders, and that includes the people who wish to have appearance-grade timber as part of their lives, and we do so in a sustainable way, and I believe the RFAs deliver that outcome.
Specifically, Minister, how has an RFA helped with the conservation of greater gliders that used to be common species, that the Conservation Advice has said that logging and loss of hollow-bearing trees is a factor towards its, a threatening process towards it. So how has the RFA contributed to the protection and the conservation of greater gliders?
Well, as Ms Lauder just said, there is a process that the RFA recognises that enables the recovery plan to be put in place. I mean, obviously, it's not anywhere near fast.
We haven't got a recovery plan yet.
Is there some reason why you just have to continually keep butting in when I'm trying to answer a question, or are you going to let me answer?
I'm just aware that I've got 7 minutes or so left. So,
okay, well, if you'd like to talk for the next 7 minutes, I'm quite happy to listen. But if you'd like me to answer your questions,
I'd like you to answer the question.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Well, as I said, the recovery plan that is in the process of being prepared by the Department of Environment in conjunction with the Victorian Government may not be being done at the speed with which you would like it to be done. However, there is a thorough process that is required to be gone through to enable the plan to be as fit for purpose as it possibly can be. And, obviously we are delighted in terms of the response rate that we've had from the recovery plan from the Leadbeater possum as an example. So I don't see that there's any reason why we can't be equally as successful with the gliders recovery plan. So, as I said, it is a balance that we put in place, and we believe that the balance has been achieved.
So essentially, once the recovery plan's in place, what you seem to be saying is that then we will be able to move on improving the conservation status of greater gliders. But I haven't heard anything that you're saying that until that recovery plan is put in place, that there are measures through the RFA to improve and stop the increasing
Well, you're making...
threatened status of greater gliders.
Well, you're making the assumption that it's only the RFA that...
No,
that
I'm just responding to your statement that you said that RFAs helped with the conservation of species.
Well, they certainly do, and as I
Okay.
said, you know, the overarching framework of an RFA, in conjunction with the actions of the Department of Environment and the actions of the state instrumentalities in relation to dealing with threatened species collectively, have provided us with a solid, integrated series of frameworks that enable us to address issues of threatened species. And I point to the increasing number of sightings of leadbeater possum as being an example of where they've worked. And I would be very pleased, and I'm very hopeful and delighted to see that the same sort of response we were able to achieve for the gliders and all of the other animals that obviously we would seek to make sure remained on the Australian landscape.
And would you agree that that's probably going to have to require a reduction in the loss of hollow-bearing trees that they require to live in?
Well, Senator Rice, one of the things that I am absolutely committed to, and that is to base all the decisions that we make in relation to dealing with these issues on science. And so the science must come first. And I note that there has been an increasing level of non-science-based, non-fact-based emotional information being put into the marketplace that we're now starting to see the community respond to. But I am absolutely committed, as is this government, to make sure that our decisions, not just on this issue, but on every issue, are backed in by the science. And we won't be bullied into making ridiculous knee-jerk decisions about things on the basis of emotional, factless information. So we will back in our decisions on science, and so therefore we will back decisions in as to, the threat that habitat reduction in forestry areas may have on particular species, but we're certainly not going to take this view that it's only logging that is a threat to our species. I mean, we already have heard time and time again that feral animals like feral cats have been a significant contributor to the decline in some of our species. Certainly fire is a major contributor to loss of habitat and obviously a threat to our species. So we will base and back ourselves in on science every single day.
Right, but you agree that the conservation advice on the greater gliders' conservation status is scientifically based?
Well, I mean, I haven't got that. I haven't been through that information, but and I'm certainly happy to have a look at it. But what I won't accept is the fact that somehow that forestry and logging is to blame for every single thing that's happened on our native landscape for the last thousands of years. What I'd like to say is that I think you'll find that yes, it has been the reduction in the habitat and the hollow logs. But these don't just exist in forestry areas. The majority of the areas that you're referring to are in reserve already. There is a very small footprint of native area that remains for logging. So I think we need to look at this across the whole landscape, but you seem to constantly come in here and focus in only on logging instead of looking at the broader landscape.
I'm just reflecting on the conservation advice that identifies logging and loss of hollow trees as being contributors to the species decline.
But is that the only?
I'm not stating that it is. It is contributed to the species decline. I've got about 3 minutes left, and I did want to move on
You're casting the
to
impression that it
plantations.
does, and I object to that.
The other side of the industry, where the most recent ABS statistics show that wood production in Australia dominated by plantation products, with them now being the source for 87% of the logs produced in the country, with 54% coming from softwood plantations and now 33% of production coming from hardwood plantations, so native forests only producing 13% of the logs produced. So I just wanted to talk about how the department deals differently with the different issues associated with the production of logs from plantations compared with native forests. And does it differentiate the programs that it runs in terms of support for plantations and support for native forests? Native forest logging.
Yes, we do. So as you know, the regional forest agreements are for native forests. We're currently developing up a new government national forestry industry plan, and in that we've been doing a lot of consultation, and time again we're hearing about the need for expansion of plantations, etc. We don't have any specific programs related to plantations at this stage, but we are conscious, and in sort of the advice we provide, etc., that plantations and native forestry are different, and there are different issues that both need to consider, and there's different products that come from any timber harvesting from both of those.
Okay. And is there any particular, so no particular programs in support of plantation forestry? Do you have any particular programs giving support to farm forestry for wood production? And I've got about 2 minutes before I've got to duck out the door. Sorry.
So the Forest and Wood Products Australia, so the RDC for forestry, as you know, the Australian government provides funding and industry matches it through levies. They have some specific research that is occurring in both the plantation and farm forestry space. So that's really where the work is happening at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Senator Rice.